Welcome to this new edition of our webinar on blue justice. And my name is Olivier Thébault. I work with Ifremer here in Brest and UMR Amur. And we've launched this webinar series as part of the activities of our research unit here, focusing on issues of liability, responsibility, and equity, in collaboration with colleagues from Kiel Marine Science in Germany, and with the support of the GDR Omer of CNRS, and a working group working on aspects of the blue economy, its development and management. I won't be giving a long introduction here. We have another legal colleague presenting today. Just to say that these presentations are also available online, so you can find them if you go to the webpage of the webinar series and follow the links, and you can find the recordings of our previous presentations from 2023. The webinar was initiated then. And without further ado, I'll let Betty Kefelec introduce our colleague Marie, who will be speaking this morning. Betty?
Yeah. Thank you, Olivier, for this introduction of the seminar. We are very happy and pleased to welcome Marie Guimezanes in our web seminar today. She's a lecturer in international law. She's part of UMR Amur, and she's working in the University of Brest. She previously worked on various aspects of international law, and especially the development law, the cooperation, and the different mechanism in development of development law. So I will not stay too long in this presentation because we are exciting to discover your work, Marie, on the climate finance, an instrument of justice for the South.
Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Olivier, for the invitation. I couldn't attend all the workshops, but the one I attended were very good quality, and it's very nice to have this series of workshops on the same issue but from different angles. So I hope I will keep up the good work. And just to mention that as Betty mentioned, I'm more about the justice aspect than the blue one. In this seminar, I don't have a law of the sea background. I work on international law of development cooperation, development finance. And I am starting to work on climate finance. But so it's obviously climate has a very deep impact on the ocean, on the coastal states, on coastal communities. So I think we can make each of us can make links to the sea and the blue aspect of justice. I will share my presentation. So climate finance has received a lot of attention recently since the Paris Agreement, but even before in 2009 with a COP in Copenhagen. It is very much discussed, and the definition of climate finance, it's very much discussed. I took the definition from the website of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it refers to local, national, transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. So it's very vast, very diverse. I will focus only on international financing. So funds that go from developed states to developing states, these terms are discussed. I don't agree with all they imply about development, but it's the wording that is used in the Paris Agreement. So I will use developing states or the South, and developed states or the North as the same thing, even though we can discuss. I will also only deal with climate finance on mitigation and adaptation. There are a lot of other finance and a lot of other mechanisms to ensure climate justice, and I will just focus on these two because they respond to the same legal environment and they have the same logic. So just to give you some example of what mitigation and adaptation is, I don't know if everybody is familiar with the language. So climate finance related to mitigation will help developing countries to reduce their emission of greenhouse gases. So, for example, it can be the restoration of a port. It can be also sustainable tourism facilities. It can be also renewable energy in the sea infrastructures. So it's really diverse. There are also adaptation climate finance, which is about helping developing countries to limit the impact of climate change on themselves, on their livelihoods, on their economy. So there are a lot of projects on adaptation. They can deal with desalination infrastructure for water. They can deal with sea level rises and putting groins on beaches to avoid it. Also on coral coral and coral preservation. Sorry. And you have also cross-cutting climate finance, which is dealing both with adaptation and mitigation. And for example, a lot of projects now deal with mangroves, and coral also can be about mitigation. So they help reduce emissions, but mainly create carbon sinks, and at the same time preserve biodiversity for climate change. So they have both aspects. Climate finance is actually part of the climate regime, international climate regime. It's part of the common but differentiated responsibilities in front of climate change, which enables to have different types of commitments for developed states, and developing states. And climate finance was originally in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. So developed country parties committed to finance, to help developing countries to finance the burden that is created by the voluntary commitments they could take in the light of the UNFCCC, but also so the paragraph 4 is helping them. So it was more mitigation for the first part. We didn't talk about mitigation yet, but it was more mitigation, and also the other aspect of adaptation finance is also present in 1982, so helping most vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change. And in 1982, there was also the creation of a financial mechanism, which was managed by the Global Environment Facility, and then later by the Green Climate Fund. I will go back to these funds later. A brief history of climate finance. I won't go through all the climate finance decisions, but so the UNFCCC Secretariat edited a booklet gathering all the decisions, which shows that there are a lot of discussions about it. If you look at it, there is highest frequency of the discussion in the COPs, but also if you see the number of pages, they grow. You have to take it from the bottom, but they grow in size every year until Glasgow, but also in the last in COP28, we also talked about climate finance a lot. I just put some important decisions. So the first one was COP7 at Marrakesh, which created several funds for developing countries to access funding through innovative mechanisms with new finance sources. And I will again go back to that later. And the main decision in recent years was 2009 and the Copenhagen COP, which defined an objective, a quantitative objective of, well, a first 30 billion for the first period, but then the definitive objective was $100 billion every year, starting from 2020. And the Paris Agreement in 2015 changed the wording, but basically reiterates this commitment. When we talk about climate finance and climate justice, the fact that rich countries and emitters of greenhouse gases channel funds to developing countries which are more vulnerable to climate change, and also with less capacities and less funding, is in its concept an instrument of justice. But justice is never really defined or never really talked about in international law, in international climate law. There is only the Paris Agreement, which refers to the importance for some of the concept of climate justice with parentheses. So it's really not a concept that is guiding climate governance in general and climate finance in particular. One of the possible explanation for this is that it's climate justice means different things to different people. It's a very diverse concept. You can talk about intergenerational justice, about internal justice. Even in France, you have debates about climate justice. So it's really difficult to have a definition, a global definition that everybody would agree with about climate justice. So here I will only speak about climate justice among states and between the North and the South. It's imperfect. It's this concept of justice is imperfect in its wording, because what are the countries of the North? Are they the same? Can you compare the US and Switzerland? And even for the South, can you compare China? And if you put China in the South, can you compare China or India and Malawi or the DRC? It's imperfect, and we can discuss it later. But that's the idea of justice I will try to talk about. And to analyze justice, I will analyze actually three broad types of justice based on the different workshop I attended. Webinars I attended. Distributive justice, compensatory compensatory justice, and procedural justice. So distributive justice, I will try to see if climate finance ensures that the resources or the burden linked to climate change is distributed fairly among states. So I will discuss what is fairly later, but this is the idea of distribution of resources and burden. Compensatory justice, I will look at it through the idea that to see if there is a link, if climate finance ensures that the states that contribute the most to climate change or have contributed the most to climate change give the most finance, and are the most vulnerable countries to climate change getting the most money, basically. So I will see if there is a link between the responsibility and the damages and the climate finance. And I will show, and you can expect it if you have followed climate negotiations, that both of them don't really work as it is right now. And that is actually procedural justice that can ensure that climate finance is an instrument of justice for the South. And procedural justice will deal with who gets a say in the decision, who can participate in the decision-making processes, are all interested states adequately represented in the discussion. And I will do that through an analysis of the climate finance rules and regulations. So how it should be, what does the law say about climate finance? I will also base my analysis on data on climate finance sources and allocation, and to see if climate finance actually is responding to these aspects. So first, climate finance and distributive justice. I'm looking first at fair distribution of resources, and then I will look at fair distribution of the burden. So first, fair distribution of resources. There is already finance flows that goes from developed countries to developing countries. It's called cooperation development, and the developing countries were really adamant in distinguishing development aids and climate finance when they in 1982, but more and more in Copenhagen and in the Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen, and the Paris Agreement. So it climate finance clearly refers to new and additional financial resources. It's very different from development aid, and the objective of climate justice is not just to have a distribution of resources, of revenue, of money, but it's really to help countries to overcome new challenges and challenge that they didn't create and that they suffer from. We could see some idea of distributive justice in the focus on LDCs and SDIS. So LDC is least developing countries, and SDIS is small developing island states. So there is a focus in the Paris Agreement and in other COP decisions that there should be more climate finance dedicated to them. It's justified both because they are poor and they need resources, about their capacity constraints, but it's also justified because of their vulnerability to the adverse effect of climate change. So it's really not an issue of distribution of resources, but more adaptation and mitigation of climate change. And in fact, there is no actual relationship between the level of GDP of countries and the amount of finance they give, or the level of GDP of the recipients and the amount they receive. I put an example for LDCs. The LDCs, they receive $14 per capita, so per person per year, compared to other developing countries that receive on average $21 US per capita. So it's really not linked. I could have put the numbers for developed states as well. The US doesn't really give as much as it would be expected according to its GDP. Distributive justice is about fair distribution of resources, but it's also about fair distribution of burden. And there are two burdens for developing countries as far as climate change is concerned, is the burden of the fight against climate change. So it refers to mitigation and the commitments they take as their nationally determined contribution to fight climate change. And there is also the burden of the impact of climate change. So it relates to how they can overcome the adverse effect of climate change and its link to adaptation. Mitigation and adaptation, they have really different logics. First, mitigation, it relates to when developed states help developing countries to mitigate and to reduce its emission. It doesn't benefit directly the developing country. It benefits the whole world. It's a global benefits for everyone. So it doesn't help really the developing country in itself. And also it's generally profitable projects. So it's you have a lot of mitigation projects in the field of energy. It's most of the climate finance in mitigation is about energy, renewable energy, structures, infrastructures, and it's also about transport. And it's a project that usually you can get once you can get return on your investment. So it generally got profitable projects. Adaptation projects, it's profitable only to the recipient states. There are a lot of projects about biodiversity and protection of biodiversity, and that would help basically everyone. But it's really looking into social environment and livelihoods and how they can adapt and change their livelihoods. It can be about fisheries, for example, fishermen that cannot access the same resources as before. So it's generally profitable to only the recipient states, and also it's about societal transformation. It's about a project that do not obviously have a return on the investment. It's about constructing other way of living that can deal with a new environment and the new climate. So obviously, as you can see, there is more finance given to mitigation rather than adaptation. And adaptation would actually be the fairest, the most fair aspect of climate finance. So in this way, you can see that actually the distribution of a burden is not really made according to the concept of justice, but it's more made about economical constraint and also the fact that mitigation impact will be shared among all the states. As far as law is concerned, the Paris Agreement reaffirmed previous COP's engagement about the fact that there should be a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And there is a progress you can see there from 2016, 2020. There is a progress towards adaptation, but still mitigation is still a lot of focus, is a big focus for donors. And another argument against the fair distribution of burden is the fact that most of the climate finance is distributed through loans. So they can be concessional loans, so loans that have a very low interest for developing states. But they can be also normal loans. So in the graph you have there, it's both. It's concessional and non-concessional loans. And there is the issue of the burden. Does climate finance create a burden for the future generation through debt? And many developing countries have already a debt, and it was getting worse with the COVID crisis. But the level of debt and the debt sustainability is really an issue for developing countries. So distributive justice could be improved in climate finance. Now, I would go through very quickly corrective justice, because I think you all know that there is an exclusion from developed states to recognize a liability system and to pay according to their responsibilities in climate change. So you can see references to this in various aspects of climate governance. The example I give is loss and damages. At COP27, there was a commitment for loss and damages, but it was not COP27. Sorry, at the Paris Agreement, there was an agreement on loss and damages, but it was clearly stated that it does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. And it's the same for climate finance. It would also be actually practically very difficult to have corrective justice or compensatory justice. It's very difficult to implement. What share of responsibility? How do you calculate the share of responsibility of each state? How do you calculate the share of the damages caused? So it's also it's about principle for developed states. Sorry. But it's also practical issues on how you deal with it as climate finance is concerned. For actual litigation, I think there are some interesting ideas to go for it, but for climate finance, it's very difficult to implement. There is one example, but it's very limited in scope and amount. It's the adaptation fund, which is funded through a share of the clean development mechanism. So the clean development mechanism enables companies that are submitted to exchanges of quotas, emission quotas. They can implement a project abroad in the developing countries, and they can take the reduction and apply to their own emission reduction. It's not really how it works, but basically that's it. And the finance involved in the clean development mechanism, there is a small part that is given to the adaptation fund. So the companies that emit the most and that use the most clean development mechanism, they contribute the most to adaptation fund, which funds the adaptation in developing countries. But it's very limited. It's a very limited example. So distributive and compensatory justice, there has been two main studies about the fair share according to these conception of justice. I put one there because the methodology, I think, is a stronger and more understandable, mainly for non-economists. And it ranks the countries based on compositing indicators, including the distributive justice aspect, the gross national income, and the corrective justice aspect, or compensatory justice aspect, which is cumulative territorial carbon dioxide emissions from 1990 to 2020. And you can see that while some countries obviously give more money than they should according to this fair share, and some countries don't. And we touch there the problem of international law and the fact that there are commitments, but they are very global commitments. The $100 billion is for all states, for public and private sources, also multilateral funds. So it's impossible without the will to coordinate among states to have really justice according to the distributive aspect of justice or the compensatory aspect of justice. So this leads me to my third part. I hope I'm not too long. Olivier and Betty, you tell me if I have to stop. Huh?
No, you're fine. Go on, Marie. No worries.
And so the only justice component of climate finance could actually be reached through procedural aspects. So how are the decisions made? How are they implemented? The projects through the climate finance project, how are they implemented? How they can be also contested and discussed. So that the three aspects I will try to deal with. But first, before dealing with justice, you need to have a global idea of the complexity of climate finance today. So these are all, well, these are not all, but these are the main institutions that who deal with climate finance. As you can see, it's a lot. You have they go from developed states at the top and developing states at the bottom. But in between, you have a lot of different structures with different rules, different mandates. It's increasingly complex. When I introduced the subject, I said that the UN created the Global Environmental Facility, the Global Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Least Development State Fund, and there are always some rules and regulations and mandates that creates a nightmare for developing countries to access funds. It requires a lot of technical capacity from developing states, and there are actually climate finance projects that are dedicated to building capacities for developing states to access funds. So it's really instead of reforming the architecture, we just give more money to help countries to get more money. So it's really a nightmare for developing countries, and it's something they discussed at every event about climate finance or even climate change. Once you have this idea, we can distinguish 3 types of channels for funds. You have bilateral funding, multilateral development banks, and global or regional funds that are dedicated to the environment or to climate. But there are many funds with different mandates. Bilateral funding, do developing states have a say in the discussion when they discuss with one donor? There are a lot of parameters to take into account, including national law of both states, their past relationships, their economic links, political links, geopolitical aspects. So it's very difficult to have an idea of the power imbalance between the donor and the recipient in bilateral funding. It also relates to international commitments about aid and development aid, and the power balance. For example, the fact that China became a big donor, it changed a lot the dynamics between traditional donor and developing states. So it's difficult to say if really there is a justice in this decision-making mechanism. For multilateral development banks, it's clearer because we have mandates of development banks. We have statutes, it's international organizations, so you know how they work. And very often the voting rights, so who makes the decision, is proportional to the share of capital. So it's the countries that give the most money to the institution that will have a say in how the institution works. So it's mainly developed countries. For international banks, global banks, like the World Bank, it's quite logical. It's historically logical, even if it's criticized. But even in regional banks, such as the Asian Development Banks or the African Development Banks, recently, because they have a growing role in climate finance or in development finance, they grew in size, they opened their capital, and actually now developed countries have a highest share than the developing countries, even in regional banks that were built in order to have power given back to developing states. So it's really a complex system, and decision-making is not fair. It doesn't give a fair representation of developing states in most development banks. And the last part of climate finance, is global or regional funds, and they very often it's difficult to have a general understanding of how they work, but generally they give the majority of the seats to developing states, and they give at least equitable representation of the different regions or the different groupings of countries. So you have seats for least developing countries, you have seats for small island developing countries, you have seats for Africa, seats for Asia, seats for Europe, etc. So it gives a fairer representation, a seat at the table for developing countries. The problem of this is that as you can see, on the top you have bilateral finance, then you have multilateral finance, and the very small yellow square is about multilateral funds. So where the developing countries get the most decision-making power is actually the institutions that gives the least of development of climate finance. And there are actually a lot of criticism recently. The Barbadian Prime Minister created what they call the Bridgeton Initiative, which calls for a global reform of financial institution in general, but mainly focused on the climate objectives, and that it cannot the international financial institutions won't be able to reach the objectives in climate if they worked as they do. Once you make a decision to allocate funds, you need to implement a project. So generally, the project has its origin in the developing state. So it's a demand, it's a proposal for a project from a developing state. Very often, it's in discussion with a traditional donor, but at least the developing state is in the driver's seat as far as the proposal is concerned. Very often, in the internal rules of the different multilateral bodies, there is you have in the proposal, you have to show that the population, the local communities, have been informed and know the project and are on board with the project. It's called free and prior informed consent. Very often it doesn't really work like that, but I won't go too deep in detail with it because I am mainly dealing with states. But one particular aspect is once the project is awarded funding, the implementation very often has to go through a third party, and this third party is very often not a national entity, not a national institution, but as you can see on the graph, it's mainly it's a green part. It's mainly international institutions that implement a project for the account of the funding body. So that also creates a lot of tension on the ground for developing countries to not get a say in the daily management of the project, even though there are always discussions, obviously, but they cannot decide how they work. And there is a reform. There are reforms in multilateral funds to increase the part of national implementing entities, actually. And finally, the last aspect of procedural justice is once a project is decided, is implemented, can developing states and developing states population have a say in it? Can they contest it? Can they say that they didn't consent? Can they say that it harms their rights to very often it's about property rights, but also the rights to a healthy environment? Can they contest it? And that all the climate finance institutions have developed accountability mechanisms in order to enable every interested party. It can be a state, but it can also be a person. Usually it's a collective of person, but it can be only one person that can request an inspection of a particular project funded through climate finance. And it's interesting because you can see that a lot of projects, a lot of cases are actually about the issue of free and prior informed consent, and the fact that the population was actually not informed by institution, by their states, but also by the international institution of the timing, the activity, the extent of the project. So it's really interesting to see that actually the procedural justice works quite well on paper, but actually the population and the state sometimes consider that they are not represented enough in the discussion. As a conclusion, I would say that the climate finance is a tool for climate justice. It's a very imperfect one. It's a very improvable one, but it is a tool in itself. And I think the climate justice must integrate better climate finance in order to work. But we have to keep in mind also that it's not only an instrument of justice, it's also an instrument of economic priorities, diplomacy, and it's a tool for states to have a relationship. So it's not only about climate. The main issue for developing countries is ownership. How can they get a seat at the table, a decision-making power? And also the very important part of loans that I discussed previously. And what we could say also is that climate justice is not about, it's not only about climate finance. It's about technical assistance, a lot of building, a lot of funding should go through building capacities for the developing states to be able to adapt to climate change, and not only on the implementation of a project. And also there is the issue that when we talk about climate justice, we cannot avoid the issue of climate migrations and how we do with the unavoidable impact that will be caused to developing countries' population. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions about any aspect of the presentation.
Thank you, Marie. That was very interesting to me, and so we have time for questions and a discussion, an open discussion. So anyone wanting to